continue this discussion with New York Times reporter Charlie Savage. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who covers national security and legal policy. Charlie, thank you for joining us. And your latest piece for The Times has this headline: How Trump is Testing the Limits of the Presidency. And in it, you write in part this: in his second term, President Trump has sought to expand executive power in many ways. One area where he is centralizing his authority is over the executive branch. Many presidents have pushed at the limits of their powers to achieve some particular goal. You continue: what makes Mr. Trump's claims to expanded executive authority unprecedented is not just his aggressiveness, but the sheer volume of the ways he is consolidating power. In his second term, Mr. Trump is asserting that presidents can take actions that were not previously understood to be within their authority. And Charlie, it's such an important piece and an important point. Tell us more about this unprecedented attempt by the president to expand his powers.
So this was a graphic thing, not a regular article that we put together as part of our one-year anniversary of the Trump 2 administration package. And if your viewers are interested, it's trying to take this myriad cascade of ways in which Trump has either usurped powers that were understood to be Congress's, or used powers in ways that were not understood to be acceptable or normal, but may have existed in other ways, and make it cognizable, understandable, because there's just been so many different ways in which this has happened. Military, inside the executive branch, involving immigration matters, et cetera. And you can sort of put them into categories and try to understand what's happening. And the part that you just read is important, because it's not like no president has before pushed the envelope to do some specific thing that he was trying to do. That is a normal part of modern American history, and people argue, hey, Obama didn't pull troops out of Libya in 2011 when the War Powers Resolution said maybe he should have after 2 months, and people argue about it every day in every different area. This administration is grabbing power, consolidating power, using power in ways that were not previously understood to exist. And as part of this earlier conversation, he's not encountering resistance. The Supreme Court is basically, with maybe one or two exceptions, letting him get away with it. And the Congress right now is completely dormant. And so this is where we are as a country. And it's not just about the particular fights, any one of these particular fights. It is about a reshaping of American-style democracy, where there is greater, concentrated, unfettered, unchecked authority in the hands of a single individual in the Oval Office, not just a branch. And the ability of Congress and the courts to impose checks and balances on whatever the whims of that individual are have completely eroded.
Charlie, before I ask you the question that I'm going to ask you, I would urge everyone watching this to look at this piece online. Visually, it's stunning, and it'll raise a million questions in the average citizen's mind. Now, Charlie, to the question at hand, and in looking at the piece and just listening to you, what has happened to the House of Representatives? What has happened to large portions of the United States Senate, just rolling over continually and continually as Donald Trump has transformed the American government?
Right. Well, this is not within the ambit of this piece, but I think it's part of the underlying narrative explanation of the times we're living through. It's quite obvious that the Republican Party in the era of Donald Trump is not the Republican Party of Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush, and before. Whatever people thought of that party and its agenda and the way it did things, this is a different party. And this is it's a party that is in the thrall of a particular individual. The people who within that party who were willing to stand up and say no to things occasionally in his first term, McCain, Romney, Liz Cheney, are gone. They've lost their seats to primary challenges. They've died. They've retired. And they've been replaced by people who either agree with Trump on these, ends justify the means policy issues, or simply are so enraptured with the status of their office and being the person on paper who has an important role in American government, they don't care about protecting their institutional prerogatives. Now, we may see at least one of the chambers of Congress flip in the midterm election. That would be the normal thing to happen. And then Congress may wake up again and start trying to perform real oversight again. We saw that in the first Trump term, and Trump simply stonewalled all of their subpoenas and refused to comply with their requests for information, and counted ultimately, when he was impeached twice, on Republicans in the Senate to prevent there from being the 2/3 majority necessary to convict. And maybe we're just going to go down that route again. But Congress abdicating its constitutional role is downstream from a Republican Party that right now sees itself clearly as nothing more than an arm of Donald Trump's will.
Yeah, and you talk about some people taken by their positions. It is nothing that they get out of being in Congress, and I've been in Congress, can assure them nothing that they get out of degrading themselves every day for Donald Trump will be worth it at the end. And same with the Roberts Court, that institution just savaging itself and its reputation this past year. My opinion, not yours, Charlie. I do think it's very important, though, for us just to put this in perspective. You know, we talked with Ashley Parker about the tactics that Donald Trump uses, which, you know, the chaos, the madness, keeping people off balance all the time. But there's the tactics, and then there's the strategy. And there was, I mean, what you wrote about yesterday and what you illustrated yesterday, the Times illustrated so beautifully yesterday, actually isn't something that Trump's winging. This was the plan from the very beginning.
There's a blueprint.
They promised they were going to push the constitutional boundaries of Article 2 powers. Talk about that, if you will, just so people can keep this in perspective, that this is a strategy they had coming into office.
Yeah, I'll say two things about that. One is, absolutely, this is not like a surprise, and it's not even something that they're ashamed of. They're proud of this. They said in running for office in 2023 and 2024 that this is what they were going to do. Maybe not all of the specifics, like, no one was talking about invading Venezuela to abduct its leader, but the notion that they were going to try to expand executive power and use it to achieve these various policy goals on things like immigration and tariffs was absolutely something that the people around Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself talked about. My colleagues, Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman, and I wrote this long series of many different things, of the policy stakes of the 2024 election, in which we talked to them, the people like Stephen Miller around Trump, and looked at what was on his campaign website. This wasn't like airy, takes about everything is going to go bad based on nothing. It was what they were saying. It was grounded in reality. They said they were going to do this. Now they're doing this. And so absolutely this was a plan, and they think that the voters endorsed this plan because they said they were going to do it, and then they voted for Donald Trump. The other thing I want to say is you brought up the Roberts Court, and this is a place where this is not about a rupture between the Trump Republican era and the prior Republican era, the era of Reagan and Bush and so forth. A huge component of this executive power grab, centralization, consolidation, expansion is the fulfillment of a vision of unfettered executive power that was hatched in the Meese Justice Department of the Reagan administration at a time when Reagan had come back into office and was trying to push a strongly traditional conservative agenda. Democrats had held the House for 40 years. They were pushing back. Congress was seen as a place where only liberals could get their agenda enacted. And the Reagan legal team invented something called the unitary executive theory. This was a revisionist interpretation of the Constitution under which the president must have absolute control over any executive act of executive authority, any use of executive power. And therefore, it is unconstitutional under this view for Congress to pass laws regulating the government, structuring the government in ways in which there are pockets of independence from the will of whoever happens to be in the Oval Office. Independent agencies, which have been upheld for a century, are unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional for there to be limits on removing inspectors general and internal executive branch watchdogs against waste, fraud, and abuse. All of these, everyone who works in the government civil service protections, all that stuff is unconstitutional. It's all absolutely at the whim of the president because all executive power must reside in his hands. The unitary executive theory. That is now being realized and put in motion by Donald Trump and the Roberts Court, which is made up of conservative lawyers who came of age in the Reagan administration and are part of that 80s era conservative legal movement. They have been wanting to do this for 40 years. And they are now, because of Donald Trump, been given an opportunity to, through the vote of a supermajority on the court, say that that is true and throw out 100 years of jurisprudence and how this country has worked to realize this earlier vision to the benefit now of not Ronald Reagan, but Donald Trump. But that is the connective tissue of this power grab moment.
The in-depth look at how Trump is testing the limits of the presidency is online now. Everybody should take a look at this visual presentation. The New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Charlie Savage, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.